All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Biggerplate.com interview. I am delighted to welcome on the call today Marcus Baur, who is the founder of Goalscape. My name is Liam Hughes. I'm the founder of Biggerplate, for those of you who don't know me. And Marcus and I reconnected, I think it's fair to say, a month or so ago after we were prompted by a mutual friend and acquaintance of ours. And it was very exciting for me to revisit Goalscape, which was a name and a product I remember from the very early days of Biggerplate, when I first started to get myself familiar with mind mapping and the wider world of visual tools. So I thought it'd be great to reconnect with Marcus and record a little interview so he can tell me and tell our community members sort of a bit of the story of Goalscape, which I think is a great sort of backstory and where the product is today and maybe where the product might go in the future. So Marcus, first and foremost, thank you very much for joining me today. You're based out of Germany at the moment, is that correct?
Yes, Northern Germany, Kiel,
Northern Germany,
to be
perfect.
precise. Thanks for having me.
So you're just about getting out of European winter, you said, hoping for some brighter sun and skies ahead.
For some saleable weather.
Sailable weather, which is a perfect segue into I think the origins of Goalscape, which has a strong sailing origin, doesn't it? So Marcus, maybe for those in our member community who are not familiar with Goalscape, I know several people will be. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of the story, the backstory, that how did Goalscape come to be? And before you do, I'll just kind of give a little bit of an overview, which is you and I have talked about this quite a bit, that Goalscape is not mind mapping software, but it's got a really strong overlap with mind mapping, but is doing something a little bit different, but sort of the overlaps quite nicely. So I think it's going to be really interesting for people to kind of see what you're doing. But maybe you could just go back in time to the origins of Goalscape and give us a little bit of a background reference before we look at where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Well, Goalscape came out of a very concrete challenge. My sailing partner and I wanted to qualify for the Olympics, and we needed a way to manage that. We were highly motivated, highly engaged, and we tried to figure out how do you do this in a meaningful way. And I loved getting things done as a method, managing tasks. I was studying architecture at that time, and I looked at, in that context, I looked at how do you solve a building challenge, which is very difficult, and as well, it's a project management challenge, but it's also a design challenge. And I followed an architectural theory by a man called Christopher Alexander. He was a professor in Berkeley, and he had a very holistic approach, and I liked that approach. And I asked myself, well, how can we tackle this challenge in a holistic way where we consciously decide in which areas we want to grow, which areas we accept maybe certain weaknesses, and to see the big picture. That was what I needed to come to grips with the complexities we had. The sport was sailing, and it's a rather complex sport. You've got a whole complex boat to take care of, but then you have all the other aspects you have in other sports as well, mental and physical fitness, but a lot of logistics as well. And all this complexity, I wanted to have a mind model initially. And because I was a visual person, I wanted to visually use a model that informs me where we want to go and where we're at, and ideally what priorities are. And that is how Goalscape came about. I was actually mind mapping before that, or I'm still mind mapping from time to time. And we took out this huge piece of paper and wrote all the things we need to do on it and started drawing connections. But then at some point, I wanted to boil it down to what is it we now actually do? And Goalscape uses a circle to enforce that kind of thinking. So unlike a mind map or a to-do list that can sort of blow up in all directions, a Goalscape calls for bringing it back together into a bounded shape. And for me, that was the ideal visual. And I still have, the thing that I do with pen and paper, I still have that on the wall, and I sometimes show it. So this was the initial Goalscape that we drew up. Actually to learn or to become really good at handling the boat that we were sailing as part of our Olympic campaign. The boat was called the 49er. It was rather challenging to sail. And we plotted all the maneuvers into this circle. And then we had certain milestones and we filled in the shading. Some maneuvers were more important than others. That's why they're bigger. And that was the initial idea. And I just used it as a mental model. And then very soon it became clear that you can use this in any context, but you need to adapt it dynamically. So it has to be a software. You can't always draw up the circle, way too much effort. So then I thought, okay, this is a great extension of mind mapping. So eventually we built the first prototype, and that's how Goalscape came about.
And so just for our kind of viewers, when was Goalscape version 1 available for people to download and try? What kind of year are we talking?
I think it was around 2010. Somewhere around 2010. And at the same time, I got involved into software development on a totally different level. I started developing software together with the German software giant SAP that was made for the sport of sailing, largely about tracking sailing boats out on the water, to make racing visible. And that's also why Goalscape became sort of a side project of mine. It wasn't my main focus for a very long time, which it is now. Since beginning of last year, I'm full-time on it. And actually the year before, I already invested a lot of time in it. But for all that period in between, it was sort of a side project, and we never really marketed Goalscape. We just wanted to use it for ourselves, for our own work.
So if you just go back to that, your paper version of what has become Goalscape, or just that period when you were trying to qualify for the Olympics, and you started to use this methodology, which I guess you were kind of figuring out the methodology as you were doing it. You were kind of coming up with it. If you can sort of, what worked about it back then? Why did you think, oh, there's something in this? What kind of prompted you to keep going? So I know you did qualify and race in the Olympics, didn't you? So I guess that's a pretty good testament to it helps. But what do you think was helping in that sort of circular, bounded, I like that phrase you used, bounded sort of diagram? That what do you think about it back in those era, even when it was pen and paper? What was it that was helping you?
Yeah, the most important thing about the bounded shape is that it reflects the reality that anything we try to achieve requires resources. May it be energy, may it be money, may it be time above all. Time is the most precious resources, especially when you try it for an event like the Olympics. You've got a deadline. You're not going to move the event. What can you achieve until that time? And this reality that resources are limited, which is kind of a reality that has become more present in the collective consciousness over the past 10 years, because we're acknowledging planetary boundaries much more than we had 20, 30 years ago, where we kind of pretended you can achieve everything. Those thinking inside those boundaries and then asking important questions, is what I'm trying to achieve here actually more important or less important than all the other things I'm trying to achieve? So the sense of relative importance was a really powerful element of the method. And then also understanding strengths and weaknesses. If you go into a competition, it's useful to at least afterwards understand where strengths and weaknesses were, to make wise decisions about where to practice next. Nothing wrong with having a weakness. You realize if you're striving for excellence that you can never fully arrive at it. But you can make decisions on where you want to excel more or less compared to other areas. And then if you're tested on your weaknesses, well, then the result is probably not that good. But you can make a smart decision about how you invest your time into your evolution so that it meets the requirements of the world. And in a sporting competition, it's that competition. Just to give you an example, if you're training for a world championship, and it's very likely that it's going to be a strong wind venue where there's lots of waves and strong wind, well, then you may want to train for that and not go to a training venue where you have light winds. But the weather can change. You end up at the Worlds, and it's a light wind World Championship. Usually, it's never like this. Everybody says, but it is. Okay, so you get tested on your weaknesses. And it's good to know strengths and weaknesses, and you can read them really easily in a Goalscape. It's the areas which are not filled in to the point where you like them to be, but you go, okay, but I'm not investing there right now because I think this is going to happen. It becomes a really good anchor to what you want to do. So in large part, it's about resource investment, but in teams, it's also about communication. Because we love the quote by the architect Buckminster Fuller, who said, the moment people do what they really want to do, it's a different kind of life. And if you're working in a team and you're not talking about goals, then everybody's kind of doing their thing, and maybe you've got a top-down structure where one person is telling everybody else what to do, but you don't get that different kind of life. The ideal scenario is that people want to do what they're doing. So why not just ask them? But if you talk about goals, you need to anchor them somewhere, and putting them in a Word document and putting them back in the drawer is not a good way of doing it. Having an anchor graphic that has additional benefits, like Goalscape has, where you also work with your resources in a smart way, is a better format for that.
Yeah, and I think the sort of idea of like an anchor graphic, and I think where you and I spoke before, and we'll probably maybe speak a little bit more about this today as well, was I think where I see Goalscape being used very, very nicely is, for example, lots of people associate mind mapping with this brainstorming process and getting lots of ideas out. And then in an ideal world, what you do is you use the hierarchy and the structure of mind mapping as a diagram type to sort of combine things, categorize, subcategorize, and make sense of it all. But when we've run training sessions and workshops with groups, sometimes that can just get very, very big, and it requires a very big map to capture and organize all the information. Now, the ideal situation is once that's been done, you then try and hone in on some sort of headline, something that can be more memorable, more high level, and they don't need to see all the detail. That's where I see a beautiful sort of use case for Goalscape, is you might have your big mind map that's captured everything that was said, and then you might just turn it into, okay, here's the really important stuff, that anchor sort of graphic of here's the goals we agreed off the end of it. And I think where Goalscape, I think since I hadn't seen it for so many years until recently when it was sort of put back onto my radar, is the elegance with which you can present that sort of anchor graphic, that final view. And then what you've now got in, which is just clearly very powerful from a project sort of basis, is the ability to manage a lot of the details within that same visual. But I think to go from the sort of expansive mind mapping world where you can sort of add in as much as you want, to then go into this bounded structure that I totally agree with you, makes you more cognizant of the realities of constrained resources, limited people, limited money, limited time, I think is a very interesting combination. And we talk a lot of Biggerplate about where mind mapping fits and when you sometimes might want to switch into other types of tool. And I think the sort of goal mapping with a mind map and then sort of putting it into a final visual in Goalscape to then sort of keep as that print above your desk or do for your weekly stand-up meetings and manage it on a screen, I think is a really nice mapping to something else overlap. But I'm interested in what you sort of view as the overlaps or the sort of differences between the mind mapping way of working, which you're very familiar with, and sort of the Goalscape. What sort of the pros and cons would you think of either approach?
Well, I would definitely situate mind mapping more in the realm of ideation, design thinking, brainstorming, when you don't have a goal structure yet. But I've been in the situation where I've done design thinking workshops, which are always lovely. You get together with a bunch of people and you openly throw around ideas. And then in the end, the result was a PowerPoint presentation that was a photo collection of all the post-it collections you had on the wall. And then you
or the flip charts. The person who gets the job of taking the photo and writing it all up.
Yeah, exactly.
What does that mean?
But now what? You're right.
Yeah.
At some point, you got to ask yourself, what is it we want to achieve? And I think a big problem, and that's where people get frustrated with the goal setting process, is if that is then set in stone. Like you could have an annual plan, and people realize you can't really have an annual plan, so they go to quarterly planning and they break it down into objectives and key results. So there's a lingo which makes it more simple. But the truth of the matter is, things always evolve, right? They always develop. And then having a starting point where you say, okay, this is our anchor, where we start with, let's evolve this now. That I think that's very important. And in brainstorming and ideation, and also in a phase where cross connections are really important, mind mapping is awesome. Once you have a goal structure, or let's call it an initial goal structure that becomes discussable and that is shared, then it's good to boil that into a goalscape. I think the problem you have with mind mapping is very often it is idiosyncratic because it reflects your hierarchy, that you have the categorizations that have formed in an individual mind. And in principle, it's the same with the goalscape, but if you want to discuss something with a team, it's eventually important that you discuss the goals. And then you need to take the step and take it from an idiosyncratic, sort of a personal network structure, which is well represented by a goalscape, and boil it into a collective one. In principle, you can do that with a mind map as well, but then the mind map doesn't give you the additional benefit of the more resourced focused view and also of a holistic image of progress. However, the work that needs to be done to take idiosyncratic mind map to a collective structure, that always needs to be done. But with goals, it's very concrete. It's like, what do we want to achieve? But the truth of the matter is that if you go inside organizations, there is shocking disorientation about what goals to achieve. And I'm not making that up. There is very concrete data. There's a Harvard study that looked at companies and asked employees, what is the strategy of the company? And honestly, the people didn't have a clue what the strategy was. So that's a great example of goals that are not really shared. And we like to ask the question, Simon Sinek asked the question 15 years ago, the why, how, what, the golden circle. What's in the center? Why are we doing this? And often it's very unclear. So it's surprising how little investment is being made to take what the company says it wants to actually reflecting that in the minds of the people in the individual teams. It's a very tricky thing to do, and it requires a lot of communication. And if you do the communication, then you want to boil that down to something that is digestible, and a goalscape is a good structure for that.
Yeah, and I think where I think what you hit on as well is the mind. We talk about this 3 phases, and it's not something we came up with. It's that sort of established. It may even be a design thinking kind of concept, which is the idea in a brainstorming session of you diverge and then you explore, and then in the ideal world you converge on some priority areas, some goals, some action, something a bit more specific. Whereas down in the diverging piece, you're sort of everything's on the table. And I think that where I really see Goalscape kind of coming into its own is in that converging piece, where we've got to say, no, there is a limit, there is a restraint. And then the other thing you mentioned there, which is also, I think, fascinating, I just think lines up beautifully with Goalscape as a visual, is OKRs as just one methodology. Because as you say, there's a lot of goal setting happening, but it's happening in very mixed ways and confused, and people get pretty confused about what is a strategy, what is a goal, what's a key result, what's a this, that, the other. But actually, to say with a Goalscape visual, which we'll have a look at in a minute, the strategy for the business this year is we're betting on and video content. Okay, our objective is increased production. How will we measure that? Here are our 3 key results. It fits nicely in a mind map, but I think it would look fantastic in a Goalscape visual as well. It's still hierarchical, but it's that sort of constrained, that bounded thing that I think you could put that up on a poster on a wall around the office, and it's a much easier thing to digest and understand, and it almost seems to be leading as a target as well. It almost looks like a sort of a dartboard sort of bullseye, doesn't it, as a visual, which I guess is just tweaking into people's sense of what an objective looks like generally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, OKR is one process. We deliberately got rid of the lingo for the different levels. I love the term North Star as a tool, as an idea, which is actually a goal that's never achieved. The North Star. I mean, literally, the North Star, you can't get there, but it helps you to gain direction, and you can extract certain values from it. It's great to have that, but Goalscape doesn't prescribe that. You could as well have just a simple project goal in the center, and then ask yourselves what is it we have to do to achieve this project. It's a work breakdown structure. In the end, it's a work breakdown structure, which is very project management-ish, if you like. And in project management, obviously, time is important. And if you want to visualize a timeline, the Gantt chart is still a super good, or the best solution, in my opinion. Only having a Gantt chart is a problem. Then you get into this waterfall mode of thinking that is problematic in itself, and it never really works out. Usually the timelines break.
Well, they don't break. They just stretch, don't they? They just go on and on.
Yeah, but if you can't stretch them, then what do you do? Like my example of, you can't move the Olympics. Yeah, you can build an airport and say, we're going to open that 3 years later, which happened in Germany. I think it was more than 3 years. But you can't do that in some contexts. And it's always, the balance of the 3 factors: scope, budget, and time. Fixing all 3 is really, really, really difficult. Then you need a massive amount of scenario planning to have any hope of achieving that. But if the timeline is flexible, and this is how software development works these days, they never create deadlines anymore. Because they realize it's so hard to estimate and build a scenario on how long it's going to take to build a certain element of a software. So they may fix scope, or they may fix budget and just say, okay, this is what we have available. This is the time and the money we have available. Let's make the best of it. But it's important to make a conscious decision on what are you actually fixing out of those 3 elements.
Yeah. So to bring us up to sort of present day, I guess. So you said you've switched into a full-time Goalscape mode. It's gone from being the sort of side project to the full-time life of Marcus. So I guess, first of all, how's that transition been for you? Have you found that sort of challenging, exciting?
I love it.
How much of a sort of lifestyle shift was that for you as well, to become the full-time Goalscape entrepreneur?
Well, I was traveling a lot before the whole pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and then I was traveling a lot less, and it was really nice with the family. My kids are just the age where they're now finishing school, and we had a great time with the family, and I was spending more time at home, and that also sort of spurred the idea, thinking about what is it I want to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And for me, Goalscape is going back to my roots in architecture, really, having a more holistic approach to design, if you like. And in this case, it's about business design. What is it a team or a business wants to achieve? And there's surprising parallels to the architectural thinking that I was very close to 20 years ago when I did my diploma in architecture. So it's for me personally, it's almost a loop that is closing, and I enjoy the work immensely. I'm working with a professor from Vienna. We just published an article on leadership and the role of goals and visions and the North Star specifically, and how you can apply certain principles and aspects from the sport of sailing to a business environment. So I immensely enjoy doing this right now. It's really, really nice. And talking to interesting people like you, it's my dream job.
Yeah, well, I'm going to loop round in a moment and ask you about people who you're talking to, because I'm fascinated as to what the Goalscape user base looks like over all these years, and maybe now, and who is maybe the sort of the prime potential user of Goalscape. But before we sort of talk about that, which I guess is kind of the looking forward view of Goalscape, maybe it would be a good moment now, if you're able to maybe show on the screen a Goalscape. I'll just check I've got the settings right on my side, because I usually don't, but I think if I say everyone can share, and then you should be able to do a screen share, and maybe just talk us through an example Goalscape. I don't know, what do you call it? A diagram, a visual, or do you just call it a Goalscape?
Well, we actually call it a Goalscape. So the name came about. Can I hide this thing up here?
What are you
Does
trying
that
to
work?
hide? No, maybe not.
No, just move the
No.
mouse away. Maybe
Yeah,
it goes
yeah.
away, it gets smaller. Well, we call it a Goalscape. It's a landscape of goals that you're building. It's giving you an overview about your goals, just like you would have the overview of a landscape if you get into a hot air balloon or a helicopter.
Yeah.
So let's go with this example here. Someone wants to climb Mount Everest, so he's got his work breakdown structure. He needs to prepare, he needs to decide on a route, and in this case he wants to clean up the mess up there a little bit. There's a cleanup project involved. So why that person is doing it is not written in the center necessarily, but that's of course an important aspect. This is just the summary, and it's a very measurable goal. You either summit Everest or you don't. Super concrete. The reason why is hidden behind that. Someone wants to prove something to themselves. It can be very personal, and in this case there's meaning derived from this cleanup project. But with regards to the structure, what you can already see when you compare this to a list, and we have a goal list down here in the bottom as well. In a list, you easily lose the overview of the big rocks, which are the big elements. And in Goalscape, you can immediately see them on the first level. These are the big
I think
parent
it's
goals.
yeah, I think it's a really important point, Marcus, as well. Sorry to interrupt you, but when we talk about using mind mapping for a lot of things, when we talk about to-do lists, but one of the things I've said to people around sort of task lists or to-do lists or anything is, when it is in list form, you lose all sense of scale. So you've got an item in the list that's a huge thing, and it's really more of a headline. And then
Yeah.
next on the list, you might have a tiny little, very granular action. And that's where the hierarchy of mind mapping helps you to understand the scale of things. But it's absolutely the same principle as at work here. You can tell that the big things in the list are preparation, the route, the other route, the leave Everest cleaner. But I think that sense of scale, it's one of the things that I struggle to try and when people are talking about using methodologies like Kanban and things like this, where you've got just a load of sort of linear lists that you then sort of move from left to right, all a great technique. But what I think is often missing there is the sense of scale. Is this a huge ticket item or a small ticket item? Because actually, again, to that issue of constrained resources, you may not be able to tackle these big ones, but you can't tell they're big until you get into it. So I think absolutely that list view down the left side there in Goalscape, very useful to have, but it's in this visual view where you really get a sense of the scale of a task or the scale of a sort of area of tasks.
The list becomes really useful if you're working down a menu. Yeah, I'm doing this, then I'm doing that, then I'm doing that. Then the list is really powerful. But to gain an overview and to strike the balance and not to fall for certain biases. For example, in the communication with yourself or other people, recency bias is always a big thing. Like, oh yeah, I just heard about this, so let's do that. Well, wait a minute. We wanted to do all these other things. Are they out the window now? And then you fit it into that context. But it's important on which level do you look at the context, and that's why the hierarchy and the structure is very important. Now, where it really comes to life is when you start working with it. So this would be a Goalscape with a little bit of progress, where you've realized, okay, the most work will go into the preparation. We're not going to do the South Ridge route. We're going to take the North Ridge route, and the cleanup project is taking shape. And the most important thing to note here is we work with relative importances. So you can make a sub goal bigger or smaller, and it immediately influences all the other sub goals unless they're locked. You can lock them, but there is a sense of relative importance here. So you make one thing more important, well, then you spend maybe not, it doesn't always correlate one-to-one with the resource spend, but it could give you an idea that, okay, if this is more important, maybe why does that rest get less important? You know, it provides context. So you could either say, I equalize all subgoals, they're all the same, I'm just interested in the structure, or something starts sticking out, and in this case, it's learning the climbing skills. Okay, that really needs to be done. And then,
so in that example, Marcus, sorry, just to pause you on the sort of the relative, I think this is a really interesting point on the importance kind of weighting that you're giving it there. So for example, in your example we can see on the screen right now, you've got a smaller section that says get seriously fit, right?
Mhm.
So that's the equivalent of me doing my daily runs and getting very good at running along the road for 2-3 hours at a time and feeling fit enough to do that. But what your diagram is showing here is that's not going to help you when you're trying to scramble up a dangerous cliff face covered with ice in Everest. So get seriously fit. It's important, but what we're doing in the visual here is putting a lot more weight visually on the climbing, the technical climbing skills. And that's just a case of dragging and dropping. And I guess it's sort of subjective. You know, you're just dragging it there and saying, well, it feels like it needs this much space, but it's a very clear visual, isn't it? And again, this I think is a little bit different to what you would see in a mind map. For example, if in a mind map you had preparation, it would have a branch off it saying get fit. It would have another branch saying technical climbing skills and the other branches, but they would all sort of look weighted equally actually in the mind map structure. And that's why I think this is just such a nice combination, because I might have used the mind map to brainstorm the things that I want to put into my goalscape. I would have come up with technical skills, get fit, but then when I put them into here, I start to do this kind of importance sort of weighting that you've got. And I just think that's a really nice combination of how you might go from one to the other if you wanted to. Obviously, you could start in Goalscape, but I can 100% see some of the work that I've done over the years would have been really nice to take a big mind map brainstorm where they've figured out the component parts and the breakdown, but to then put it into something like this where you give that weighting, you give that sense of constraint, I think is a really interesting sort of next step after a mind map for certain areas.
That's exactly the idea. Because if you would come out of a brainstorm session and you've got all the things, look, by the way, I don't know nothing about mountain climbing. You know, this is just it's just an example. But precisely, I may have gone and done a brainstorming session, got all the elements, and then I see get seriously fit. And learn technical climbing skill, and I think they're equally important. Now I'm talking to someone knowledgeable, a coach, someone who's climbed Mount Everest 5 times, and says, yeah, you need to be fit, but by far the most important thing is that you've got your climbing skills sorted, else you'll get in real trouble, because, you know, Everest is actually not that difficult a mountain to climb in terms of fitness, but you got to watch out for this or that. So then you reprioritize it, and that has a result in how you reflect a certain thing in your mind, because it would be wrong to just go off and do a whole lot of fitness training and think the climbing stuff doesn't matter. I should have used the sailing example. I know more in that in that arena.
Well, no, I think actually the sailing arena is probably something that fewer people could probably relate to, whereas I'm sure all of us can look at the example of trying to climb not necessarily Everest, but any sort of major mountain if we don't have that skill. So I think it's a nice illustration of the
bear in mind,
process.
it may be the other way around. You know, it could be that an experienced mountain climber says, "Hey, this is more important." I don't know that, but for example's sake, this is what would have arrived not only from a brainstorming session, but also from a consulting session with someone who knows what needs to be done. And then as you then work on your goals, you know, you can highlight your progress from 0 to 100%. And obviously there it's important, what does progress actually mean? You need to define that for yourself, and maybe even rephrase the goal in that context. So in our sailing context, it was milestone number 1, which we regarded roughly 20%, was we want to understand what we're doing, right? And have it written down. We're clear about how we want to do a maneuver. Then milestone number 2 was we can do it 9 out of 10 times in a training environment where we're not stressed. And milestone number 3 was we can do it 9 out of 10 times in a stressful racing environment. And that was then basically goal achieved. But you could argue, well, we strive for excellence, but we can never get to 100%. So then you need to mark in your mind, okay, 90% is all we want, right? For now. And then maybe we loop back to the first milestone and revisit the process to then work on it again. So goal definition is important, but set that aside, you can mark your progress with this shading. And this way, you can quickly see areas which are well developed and areas which are not so well developed. And depending on the importance, it also reflects upwards. You can see in the parent goal how, depending on the importance, there is a sort of aggregate on the top level that gives you an idea of where you're at. And same in the middle. You see that dot that grows from the inside out. That's everything grows from the outside in because that's where the action is. But in the inside goal, you've got this dot that in the background that grows from the inside out, and that covers that shows the progress made overall. So relative importance, I mean, first of all, structure, goal structure in a bounded shape, then relative importance and progress is something that you can easily see. And then you can employ color to add additional order on top of it, or you can use tags. You can give the color a name, like red in this case is critical, but you can change that to whatever you like. You can pick your colors, and some have a meaning, some may not. That's up to the user to define. And then with tags, you can superimpose any additional order you like. And that's where we start using lists, where we actually, when we want to use the goal structure for productivity, we tag goals as to be done next or to be done now. And then we can filter for those goals simply by selecting that tag. So the next list would look like this, and the now list would look like this, a shorter list. So you can stick to the discipline of not having too much on your now list. And this way you can actually draw from the goal structure to the task structure.
Yeah, I remember when we spoke a few weeks ago. I love the simplicity of the next and now list. It's one of the biggest challenges I have personally in terms of just my workload at Biggerplate, but it's also a thing that I see people struggling with the most when they are, trying to use mind mapping for kind of task management or any kind of technique, is that you've got to prioritize a few tasks. And we always encourage people to do a top 3 thinking. So if you've got 10 tasks, which are the 3 that matter the most and this kind of thing. But I think a next and now is a really nice framework. And then just a couple of sort of practical questions, Marcus, if I can, just again, because some people won't have seen this. So the thing you showed, which is as you progress the goals at the sort of outer edges, that progresses sort of the shading to show the overall sort of project progress. So that's something that I think you see sometimes in mind mapping software called a sort of a roll up. So it's where you progress at the outer edges and it sort of rolls up the progress. So I think that's a really nice, again, parallel with mapping. And then the other thing you've started to show us as well here, which is very, very important in the world of mind mapping, is not color for the sake of color. It's color that has meaning, and color coding, and using color as a way to sort of add a lot of extra context or meaning to the same information. So if it's a red, it's off track, or if it's a green, it's on track. Or I'm guessing you might have color coding to represent sort of, this is the marketing team, this is the finance. There's any number of ways you could do it, but again, a very kind of clear, clean visual output here. And then one of the other questions I had is just again, we talk about the mind map structure. You start with that central topic and you can just expand outwards forever. Could I, if I was looking at this Goalscape where you've got, for example, learn technical climbing skills, could I break that down further? Can I keep expanding out in the layers, or is there a limit?
Yeah, there's no limit. You can unfold them, and as a matter of fact, you can see those are not defined yet, but I could go on and break it down further. And I can also, for a certain context, I says, okay, today we only want to talk about the preparation part. So I double click on preparation, and then that becomes the central goal. You can see where it sits in the overall landscape of the goals on top, but you still have your You still have your breadcrumbs here of where this goal feeds into. Now I selected the central goal of this centered sub-goal, but you can still see the breadcrumbs here. And then you can start building out further. So you're not limited by any lingo or granularity level. It's more a question of, does it make sense to break this down further?
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
the general learning is it's easier to stay motivated on goals where the finish line is not too far away, right? So if you've got these huge goals, but they're not broken down, it becomes a lot harder to achieve them. So you're encouraged to create that work breakdown structure. And I think that's the same in mind mapping. That's where, okay, yeah, that's actually consisting of more aspects like that. And then just like in mind mapping, you can drag and drop them, reorder them. Actually, this was ordered by month, so we don't want to move that. You can move the goals anywhere, copy and paste them. So it is somewhat similar to mind mapping or Kanban boarding. It's quite tactile. A goal has a location. It sits in a certain place. It has a weight, a size, and you can move it around almost like a thing to build structure.
Yeah, I mean, this again is why I think there's just great overlaps with the world of mind mapping, both in terms of the organizing of the ideas and the information, but also in terms of that tactile aspect. I talk to people all the time about one of the most powerful aspects of mind mapping software is just the ability to move things around and sort of try it out in different places, like a jigsaw puzzle. You sort of see, does that fit there or does it fit there? And so I think this is why I was so keen to sort of share this with our members, is I think there's a huge number of overlaps between what you've done with Goalscape and what's possible with mind mapping software. And I think they could be fantastic sort of complementary ways of working. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's and both. And you get some really, and what I love about the visual, for example, that you've got on the screen right now is you've shown you can break it out into all this very granular task level detail, but I could fully see, this visual that we see on the screen right now. Like I say, you could have that printed out every week or month on the whiteboard in the office to say, how's our progress this month? It's a very sort of clear visual understanding. And I like that as a sort of an output that can be updated, obviously, if you're in the software. And
yeah,
it's
easy
sorry.
it's easy to export and actually to print out without the background in very high resolution. So if I download this, I probably can show it in a minute. So there it is. So if you that image that comes out of it, it has very high resolution. So you could easily print that. It's there's no limit. And by the way, you can also easily export it into any other solution like mind mapping software. And conversely, you can import a mind mapping solution. It's actually going to have higher resolution than that in a second. It's so high resolution that it takes a second to draw it. So now you can see it very high resolution.
I could see these kind of image exports being used in sort of business plan documents. I could imagine people sort of submitting a proposal to investors or a pitch deck or something and saying, this is the goals we're going to try and achieve and these kind of things. But I could also see it being used in a sort of a reporting situation as well. So maybe a quarterly report that's going to shareholders or going to stakeholders, and it might have that same sort of goal structure with a sense of how did we do on those goals, and a very simple sort of visual snapshot of we completed 2/3 of the pie, and it's very clear and very visual. And then if people want to go into the details, well, maybe that's in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere, I don't know. But I think the outputs you can create here, I think, are very visually friendly for us to sort of absorb.
Well, to make it come alive, you want it to be used in status meetings, at least in status meetings, if not in daily meetings, where you can also use a very elegant method that gets around all the status clutter, if you like. When people stop reporting status, they want to justify what they're doing, which is understandable, but it takes a lot of time. And then you need to discern the excuse from the good reason from the blatant lie, maybe. Instead, you can ask a really simple question. what's your confidence to achieve that goal, in the given time frame we have? And that information is super, super useful because it brings together so many aspects. And then you could additionally say, we don't want to micromanage here. If confidence is high, we just let it go. Let's not even talk about the status of goals where the confidence is high. Let's see what we can do in the goals where the confidence has dropped, because it may mean we have to write it off because circumstances changed. We can't achieve it. We were wrong in what we were expecting, which is normal. Fail early, fail often. That's okay. Or much more importantly, can we help? Is there a way to help so that we can still achieve that despite the fact that confidence have dropped? Can we get rid of the reason why confidence has dropped? And then you just tag the goals where you have a confidence drop, and you just talk about those. It makes meetings super efficient, and you just anchor the graphic, and then just like you would have now in next tags, you could have a tag that is confidence low, maybe here the critical ones, which are marked red now, then you would just talk through those in the next meeting.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. I love the idea of confidence. We actually we use a confidence rating actually in Biggerplate on some of our sales, which again, it's not unusual, but you say, well, maybe the sale might be worth £100, but I'm 10% confident that it's actually going to happen. Okay, so at the minute it's worth £10, and then a week or two, maybe you have a really good call and you go, okay, I'm now 80% confident, and now suddenly that's worth £80 in the sort of the pipeline and these kind of things. So I love the idea of using confidence in this context around the tasks and the goals to be completed as well, because as you say, we've done this every quarter for as long as I've run Biggerplate. We set great goals and we try and be very specific and clear, but then something unusual happens and you say, well, no, my confidence has gone from 90% to 9% because the world has changed around me for some reason. So I love the idea of trying to represent that in the visual as well. That's great. But yeah, so Marcus, just in the interest of time, I don't want to keep you too long, but I suppose what we're looking at here is, and it's what I loved when I sort of rediscovered Goalscape a couple of weeks ago, was we are looking at a real sort of 2024 version of Goalscape, well, probably 2023, I guess, but a real modern version of Goalscape, and it looked sort of wildly different to when I last remembered seeing it, which is probably 10 years ago, which it looked great, but now it just looks phenomenal. And so I'm interested in a couple of things to sort of maybe take us from where are we today and where are you going to try and sort of go with things in the future. I suppose I've got two questions. One is, do you have much of a sense of what type of person or what type of job role is really leaning into Goalscape? Is it small business owners who are trying to do sort of a bit more intuitive planning? Is it big enterprise project teams? Do you have a sense of sort of the use cases that you're seeing now over so many years of Goalscape, even though it's not been your full-time thing? Do you have much of a sense of who your users are? And then I suppose with that in mind, do you have a sense of where you need or want to take the product going forward to sort of cater more for those users and what you're learning about them?
Well, our customer base is 50-50 business, and the other 50 is consumer. There's no job. I mean, if you look at the personas, there's not really that clear-cut persona, especially not in an industry. It's in all industries. And the best identifier we could find was people who are serious about achieving their goals. If you're not serious, then if you're looking at work as a chore and you don't really care, you're not at the point where you ask yourself, how can I do this better? Then you won't do that because it's extra work, right? If someone is in the business of pretending to achieve a goal, the last thing he wants is Goalscape, because it makes it really transparent. So
does it lead you? Does that insight, now you say that, does that lead you back to sports? Given your background, obviously in the sailing and the Olympics, but do you see this maybe as something, or can you see it? Could you see other sports? But should the Premier League clubs in England or the Bundesliga in Germany for football, could you see it being used in a sporting context?
It is being used in those contexts. A lot of Olympic federations are using it. Olympic athletes are using it. We have many gold-winning athletes that have used Goalscape, and it's even used in the F1 and in the F1 of sailing, which is Sail GP. So it's really all over the place. But if people are not serious, then they won't, because it's work to create a goal structure. It really is. It doesn't come by itself, and it's not like Goalscape takes that and does it itself. We will integrate AI, and AI is surprisingly good at creating initial goal structures or work breakdown structures. But still, if you want to make it fit the context, you need human level intelligence, and you need to put in that work. So really, the acid test is: are you serious about achieving the goal? And interestingly, I was surprised how low motivation levels were in the business world. And study after study is showing that. Gallup is doing the biggest one every other year. How low motivation levels are, and I couldn't make sense of it. Why are they high in the sporting world, where you're doing something that is essentially meaningless? There's no real benefit to society apart from the entertainment aspect. I understand why sportsmen are doing it. It's fun, it's enjoyable, it's a way to experience yourself and to prove yourself. But for the larger society, what's the benefit? That's rather weak in that area. So then you go to business and you're like, okay, there's products and services that make our world run better. Why aren't people really motivated? And the only way I can make sense of that is abstraction. Business has generated levels of abstraction which are ill-suited to generate the sort of motivation we have in sports. To give you a simple example, you tell someone, here's the start line, over there is the finish line, run as fast as possible. Everybody gets that. But if you tell someone our annual goal is to bring up the bottom line by 3.5%, and that's going to come back from the tax lawyer 3 months after the year is over, that's not a goal anybody gets motivated about. And the focus on financial goals leads to a lot of abstraction, which is problematic. And then that we don't have goals in place, and that's why I think a North Star can be highly valuable if it's authentic, that informs people what are they going to work for every day. The Japanese call it ikigai. I think that's an interesting concept and term. People need to understand what their work is for, and they need to have ideally they can influence the goals that are being set. Like I said in the beginning, the moment people do what they really want to do, it's a different kind of life. If you can generate that sort of goal structure, and you need to generate it with the people inside the organization, then you've got a much more powerful basis for work. And I would expect that an organization that has a useful service and product at its center should generate higher levels of motivation than a sports team.
But that's not what we see. I suppose probably a lot of people watching this would probably even feel that in their own world. And I think, to your point, there's the degree to which you're motivated to work for somebody else to make more money is probably quite low. But actually, if your motivation is a bit more personal, a bit more kind of inherent and to your personality, that's what you've got to try to tap into. And I guess a lot of the time people join a company because they are drawn to the purpose, to the mission, to the vision. But I think, as you say, sometimes the companies can then obscure that or sort of diminish that by being very focused on these quite abstract goals.
Yeah, and I mean, if you focus on financial goals and then you create a situation where the employee is not really incentivized to achieve these financial goals, maybe there's a bonus schema in there, but that's still relatively weak compared to the motivation of the owner, who really benefits from the profits. You've created a situation that has weak incentive. A weak incentive scheme. And if you don't fix that, you're not going to get higher levels of motivation.
And I think that's also where they talk about sort of intrinsic versus sort of extrinsic value, isn't it? Is money is not actually particularly intrinsic for a lot of people. It's what is it sort of representing, or what else could be a bit more of a driver. So I guess as you position and promote Goalscape as a a solution or a supporting tool for good goal setting, I suppose you're probably going to find yourself getting drawn a lot into these kind of academic explorations of what is and is bad and what is good goal setting as well. So I guess you're probably going to be absorbing quite a lot of the literature around good or bad objectives, good or bad goal setting, and probably then trying to bake that into the product. And you gave a little bit of a tease there around the sort of the future roadmap, which was the second part of my question. You said around trying to build or planning to build rather AI into the tool in some way to support people's kind of goal generation and these kind of things. So as we look forward, if I was saying sort of a 2, 3, 4 years of Goalscape development to come, particularly now with you full time on it, what sort of areas do you think you're going to be focused on with the product? If you can sort of talk in relatively general terms, AI seems to almost be a must-have now for any software developer going forward. So how do you see that fitting into the tool, and sort of what else maybe is on your horizon or your radar in terms of technology trends or global trends that you think you might need to try and align Goalscape with?
Well, one thing that is important to us is that we don't turn it into a Swiss Army knife. We want to retain the simplicity, and that's also why we're not adding mind mapping functionality, because there's so many good mind mapping solutions out there. We don't want to make it overly complex. It's for creating meaningful goal structures, and that's what we wanted to focus on. Since the large language models that have exploded last year are quite good at creating these work breakdown structures, we're going to leverage that power. So, but I'm absolutely convinced there's no replacing of the human agent to adapt such a structure to a given context, which the LLM can't do in its completeness. There's no way, especially when it comes to sense of priority and measuring progress and all of that. Especially on the softer progress criteria, with absolutely measurable ones, it may be easier. So that we will integrate, but then we want to grow more into the mobile space, which is something we haven't tackled satisfactorily yet. You can use Goalscape on a tablet. You can even use it on a mobile phone, but it's not a downloadable app from the app store. So we're going to go in that direction. We're going to also explore the structure a little bit more to see, that open the possibility that you can compile Goalscapes of various sources into one. So you could have a separate work Goalscape and a life Goalscape, but you can bring them down into one Goalscape for you personally. So you have your now and next list of both realms of your life in one.
That's an interesting idea, because I suppose that makes me think of something we talk about at Biggerplate with companies and people, is sort of dashboards and using mind maps that sort of give you an overview of lots of different things. Then I could see a world where you might have a sort of a master Goalscape at this level that's actually being fed by 3 or 4 or 5 Goalscapes at this lower level. Yeah, that would be kind of cool, because that master level map would be your sort of dashboard view of how the different domains performing or not performing.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And
nice.
Apart from that, we're just going to make it more pleasing to use, give people more ownership of it. For example, add their company logo, replace possibly our logo, because we're not, obsessed with that, with the brand awareness. We believe that the brand awareness has to come from the method, and that's something that we really want to push for in the coming month and years. We have never talked about the method. Maybe my naive assumption was that the power of the model is good enough to get people going on it, but with the overload of information that we all have these days, if we're confronted with something new, we're usually looking left and right. Are other people using that? And we don't have much time for exploration. And so taking someone by the hand and explaining the method and saying, this is what this is about, this is what it can do for you, and also coaching people into creating good content with it, because that's a completely different challenge. It's not everybody can set goals, largely because people haven't been given permission to set goals for themselves. That's an area where we want to evolve further. That's really, it's not only the tool, is how do you put it to use.
Yeah, and I think this has been, and I think you and I spoke about this a little bit before. I think it's been one of the challenges, if I was being generous, but actually one of the failings to an extent, I think, of mind mapping software vendors and probably Biggerplate even as well, is you can't just put the tool in front of someone and say, go for it. You can, and some will get to grips with it very easily, and it's not that complicated, but people's appetite for exploration, people's appetite for failing, people's appetite for learning curves is very, very low. And that's where I think your point exactly is around having the tool is one thing, but it's got to be married up with technique. And the technique guidance can be very, very simple. For Biggerplate, when we talk about mind mapping, we talk about capture and categorize as the first two things. Well, the minute
Yeah.
you start thinking about that in a mind map, you're up and running.
Yeah.
The tool, you've then got to figure out how do you capture and categorize in the tool. But just a couple of simple reference points of technique can get people started very easily. But I do think a lot of people do get quite intimidated by the blank page mind map or possibly the
Yeah.
blank page goalscape. And we've all got to do, I think, a bit better at showing them the simple techniques that are going to get them started and ideally find them a quick win almost. They need to be able to see it works quite fast.
Yeah.
Otherwise they abandon the tool, whether it's
Yeah.
mind
Yeah.
mapping, goalscape or anything. People abandon tools and techniques now so quickly unless they're going to feel that sort of instant result. So I guess for you, the challenge is the same. You've got to get people
Absolutely.
feeling comfortable with a blank goalscape document and feel it's not unachievable to sort of get something out of it very quickly.
And you've done a lot of great work around templates. I think that's important, and we discussed potentially collaborating on that. It's makes a big difference. If a company comes to me and asks me, well, how do I structure my goals with Goalscape? I sometimes give them this example. You can still see my screen?
Yes, yeah.
So I asked the question, do you have a North Star or something like a beating heart that people can really relate to in your center? And not just pretend that they know it or that they have read it 2 years ago. Do people feel for that? That's an important driver. So try to build that, but you're never going to achieve that goal. That's your North Star. But then if you want to get away from abstraction, the gray ones are abstract goals. The financial health of a company, hugely important, but relatively abstract. We're still these evolutionary beings that are used to running from A to B, gathering stuff, hunting, gathering, and whatnot. and numbers on a financial spreadsheet are just super abstract. What's not abstract for us, and what's absolute core to any business, is products and services. And when we talk about products, it doesn't have to be the glorious iPad. It could be, a company could be producing a valve that helps to save energy. Why shouldn't people be proud and motivated? And why can't you put a sporting aspect in there and say, look, there's a competing product out there. It's saving more energy. We got to get our act together. We got to work on those products. You've got a motivating goal, right? But if you drown it in departments and 5 levels of middle management, and then it's so abstract that nobody's going to care anymore. Right. So I would argue for a simple goal structure. Also, if you want to improve a place, very concrete. If you have an event to organize, very concrete. And the gray, the abstract goals, they're left over and they're important. You say we've got a bad company culture, we want to do something about that. That's a relatively abstract goal, but it could be super important. But you got to put more love into those. Those are easy. Products and services, we got to improve the product. We want to bring up the net promoter score by 1 point. What is it we have to do? What's the breakdown? What does that look like? So this is the kind of assistance and support companies need in order to change the way they work. And we're going to do more of that. And frankly, we're going to learn a lot more about that as well, because we don't pretend to have all the answers.
That's a relatively strong start point. I like to play the role of uninformed person. It's more interesting to ask questions, I think. But yeah, I think that's a really great place for us to probably pause there, Marcus, in terms of where you're going with it, where you've come from with Goalscape. But I think you've given us a fantastic look at the product, and I know for a fact now lots of the people that are very enthusiastic mind mappers on Biggerplate will, I'm pretty confident, be popping over to Goalscape to take a look. We'll make sure the links and everything are in the video descriptions and accessible. So I certainly would encourage people to go and have a play with Goalscape and think about it not as an alternative to whatever mind mapping software you're using, but I think it's a really fantastic complement to. And you, over time, I think if you're using both a mind mapping tool and Goalscape, you'll start to see when one is more appropriate for use than the other. And I think where Goalscape, I do think, has a really interesting use case is for these nice, tidy visual outputs, where some people just won't interpret a mind map, no matter how simple you make it for them. Whereas I think the Goalscape, this circular thing, this kind of target visual, almost feels like, I think people kind of will get that relatively quickly. So yes, I certainly want to encourage Biggerplate members to go and take a look at Goalscape. But in the meantime, Marcus, I'll say a huge thank you to you for your time today and for sharing what you're doing. It's great to reconnect with you. I think when I looked at LinkedIn, my first connection with Goalscape was around 2012, I think. So it's great to see you guys still doing things and now full time as well. So I'm sure the momentum will be even greater with you full time at the helm of the business. So we wish you best of luck, and we'll probably try and do this again a year from now and see how you've done on your own goals for the year.
Thank you very much, Liam. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus. We'll catch up again soon.
Bye.